The city of Tokyo pulsed around him, a symphony of light and sound that he couldn't hear. For Julian Vance, the world outside the 35th floor conference room was just background noise. A screensaver on the massive display of his life. His focus was a single, glowing point on the spreadsheet projected onto the wall. A 9-digit number representing a deal that would cement his company. Vanguard Digital as a global titan. He wasn't a man who celebrated wins with champagne and backslaps. For Julian, the victory was in the number itself, a clean, perfect sum that validated years of calculated risks and soul-crushing work. Life, in his experience, was a series of such transactions. You put in a specific input, and you got a specific, measurable output. Emotion was an unquantifiable variable, glitch in the system that he had learned to delete long ago. He lived his life by this code. His penthouse apartment in New York was an investment, not a home. His friendships were strategic alliances, not sources of comfort. Even his family, what little was left, was managed through a discreet financial advisor and scheduled brief phone calls. Everything had its place and its price. His world was a fortress of glass and steel, built on the foundation of his own relentless logic. He was, by any measure, a success. And yet, as he sat in the sterile, air-conditioned room in Tokyo, watching his Japanese counterparts bow and sign their names to the contract, he felt nothing. No joy, no relief, no satisfaction. There was only the quiet hum of the projector in the distant, a muffled rumble of a city that felt 1,000,000 miles away. His actual home, the one place he owned that wasn't just a financial asset, was a sprawling structure carved into the hills overlooking the Pacific. He called it the property, never home. It was a masterpiece of modern architecture. All sharp angles, floor-to-ceiling glass, and a stark, minimalist interior that felt more like an art gallery than a living space. The walls were white. The furniture was a severe collection of black leather and chrome. And the only art was a series of enormous abstract canvases that had cost more than most people's lifetime earnings. They were chosen not for beauty, but for their investment value and their ability to fill a wall without imposing any personality. The property was quiet. It was always quiet. The silence was so profound it was almost a sound in itself, broken only by the whisper of the ocean breeze against the panes of glass or the faint, rhythmic click of the pool's automatic cleaner. It was a space designed for a man who didn't want to be disturbed. It's not even by his own surroundings. Into this carefully curated silence, a new element had been introduced 6 months ago. A girl. Julian didn't think of her by name, though he knew it. He thought of her as the maid, a necessary component to maintain the property's sterile perfection. His previous housekeeping service had been a team of efficient, middle-aged women who moved through the house like ghosts, tidying and disappearing. But the agency had sent a replacement. A single young woman. The first time he saw her, he was struck not by her presence, but by the sheer incongruity of it. She was like a wildflower growing in a crack in a concrete sidewalk. Her file, which he had skimmed with the same detached interest he'd give a stock report, said her name was Isla. She was 22 years old. A student at the city college, studying something he couldn't be bothered to remember. She was there, the file stated, to earn money for her tuition. That file did not, however, mention the way the morning sunlight would catch the reddish-gold strands in her dark brown hair, turning them into a crown for a few moments each day. It didn't mention the quiet focus in her hazel eyes as she polished a chrome surface until it reflected the empty room with perfect clarity. And it certainly couldn't quantify the simple, fluid grace with which she moved. She didn't clean like the others. She didn't just wipe and vacate. She moved through his house with a gentle reverence, her steps making almost no sound on the polished concrete floors. She would straighten a stack of magazines he'd left out. Not because it was her job, but with an instinct for order that matched his own. She would water the tall, sculpted plants in the corner, her touch gentle, her brow furrowed in concentration. Julian, observing her from his office window or from across a room, would find himself watching her for a moment too long. He would analyze her beauty the way he would analyze a piece of art. The line of her jaw was symmetrical. Posture was excellent. Her movements were economical. It was a detached, clinical appreciation, like noting the fine craftsmanship of a watch. She was, he decided, an aesthetic upgrade to the property, a pleasant, unimportant detail in the grand design of his life. He knew nothing about her, beyond the bullet points on her resume. He didn't know what music she liked, or if she had a family, or what dreams fueled her late-night studies. He didn't ask. To ask would be to introduce an unquantifiable variable into his perfectly calibrated world. And Julian Vance did not tolerate variables. Back in Tokyo, the deal was done. The last hand was shaken, the last bow executed. His team was celebrating, planning an elaborate dinner that would involve more sushi and more karaoke than Julian could stomach. He made his excuses, pleading exhaustion, and retreated to the hushed sanctuary of his hotel suite. The room was just as sterile as his property, with a view of a neon-drenched city that felt alien and overwhelming. He stood before the wall of windows, watching the endless river of headlights flow through the streets below. Everyone, he thought, was moving with purpose. Everyone had a destination. He looked at his own reflection in the glass, a man in a tailored suit, his face unreadable, his eyes hollow. He had reached his destination years ago. He had arrived. So why did it feel like he was the one standing still? It was then, in the middle of the world's busiest city, that the thought came to him. It wasn't a thought, really. It was more like a feeling, a small, quiet pull from somewhere deep inside his chest. It was illogical and completely out of character. I should go home. The thought was so foreign he almost dismissed it. Home was the property. The empty, silent, perfect place. Why would he go back there early? His schedule was clear for another 2 days. He could work, or he could rest, or he could fly to Singapore and set up another meeting. He could do 1,000 things that made sense, that were productive. Go home. The feeling came again, a little stronger this time. It wasn't a desire for comfort or rest. It was something else, something he couldn't name. It felt necessary. For the first time in a long time, Julian Vance didn't analyze the feeling. He didn't try to break it down into its component parts. He just felt it. He pulled out his phone, his fingers moving with a certainty that surprised him. He ignored his overflowing inbox, the messages from his assistant, the congratulations from his partners. He found the airline app, his thumb hovering over the screen for a second before he tapped on the next non-stop flight to Los Angeles. He didn't book a car service. He didn't notify anyone at the property. He just clicked confirm. The decision was made. Sudden jagged crack in the smooth, polished surface of his perfectly planned life. He was going home. Asterisk, the flight home was a long, purgatorial stretch of time and space. Julian sat in the cocoon of his first-class seat. But the leather felt like sandpaper against his skin, and the recycled air tasted stale. Outside the little oval window, the world was a deep, endless blue. It was the color of a screensaver, a placeholder for something real. He wasn't thinking about the deal. The 9-digit number, which had been the entire focus of his existence for the past 6 months, had already been filed away in some dusty corner of his mind, a trophy he had no desire to look at. Instead, his thoughts were loose, unruly things, drifting like clouds. He kept seeing a flash of color, reddish gold, like a spark from a fire. He'd close his eyes and see it, catching a sliver of light that didn't exist in the dim cabin. It was her hair. Isla's hair. An absurd, useless piece of data to be stuck on, but there it was, a glitch in his system he couldn't delete. The feeling that had made him leave Tokyo, that strange, quiet pull, was still with him. It wasn't a thought. It was a physical sensation, like a low-grade fever or the phantom ache of a lost limb. It was telling him to move, to go, to get to a place he wasn't even sure he wanted to be. The town car that met him at LAX was a silent, climate-controlled bubble, a perfect extension of the life he had built. As they inched their way through the city's snarling arteries, Julian watched the world outside the tinted windows. He saw a young woman in the car next to him, singing loudly and badly along with the radio. Her head thrown back in a moment of pure, unself-conscious joy. He saw a man on the sidewalk, his face etched with worry as he held a crying child. He saw people arguing, people laughing, people living their lives in a chaotic, messy, glorious tangle. It was a world of variables, of unpredictable outcomes, and unquantifiable emotions. It was the world he had spent his entire life trying to insulate himself from, and yet watching it now, he felt a strange, hollow ache. He was separated from them by a pane of dark glass, a ghost in his own machine. The driver, sensing his mood, didn't turn on the radio. The silence in the car grew heavier with every mile, thickening until it was suffocating. The car finally turned onto his private road, and the noise of the city fell away, replaced by the gentle rustle of wind through the trees. When the house appeared, it wasn't the triumphant sight it usually was. It looked severe, imposing, a stark block of glass and steel hunkered down against the hillside. The sun was beginning to set, casting long, sharp shadows that made the house look even more unwelcoming. As the car pulled to a stop, the driver killed the engine. The sudden silence was so complete it rang in Julian's ears. He didn't wait for the driver to come around. He pushed the door open himself and stepped out into the warm, still air. He stood for a moment, looking up at the house he owned, the place that cost more to run in a month than most people earned in a decade. It didn't feel like a home. It felt like a monument to a mistake he was just beginning to understand. He keyed in the code at the front door, his fingers moving slowly, deliberately. The heavy door glided open, and he stepped inside. The first thing he noticed was the silence. It wasn't the usual peaceful silence he paid for. This was something else. It was a dead silence, an empty silence. It felt like the air itself was holding its breath. He dropped his bag by the door, the soft thud of it hitting the floor unnaturally loud in the stillness. He listened, straining his ears for the familiar, subtle sounds of life. The soft pad of feet on concrete, the distant whir of the vacuum, the faint melodic hum of a song Isla sometimes listened to on a small speaker while she worked. These were the sounds that filled the vast empty spaces. The quiet proof that he wasn't alone. There was nothing. A knot of unease began to tighten in his stomach. This was wrong. He walked through the cavernous living room, the setting sun casting orange and purple streaks across the polished concrete floors. Everything was in its place. A row of design magazines were perfectly aligned on the glass coffee table. The giant black sectional looked like it had never been touched. The chrome and glass surfaces gleamed under the recessed lighting. It was all perfect. And the perfection itself was what was wrong. It was the perfection of a museum, not a home. It was the kind of sterile cleanliness that comes from a place no one is actually living in. He walked into the kitchen. The air was cool, smelling of stainless steel and expensive polish. The massive marble island was clear, not a single crumb or coffee stain marring its surface. The refrigerator hummed its low, mechanical song, the only sound in the entire house. He opened it, a habit he didn't even realize he had. Inside, everything was neat and organized. A bottle of water, a carton of eggs, a few unremarkable condiments. It looked like a refrigerator from a furniture showroom, not one where a person kept her lunch. He closed the door, the soft click echoing in the quiet. Annoyance, sharp and quick, flared in his chest. Where was she? This was her job. He paid her a significant salary to be here, to maintain this order, and she was simply gone. His hand went to his pocket, his thumb already finding the cool, smooth surface of his phone. He was going to call the agency. He was going to have her fired. It was a breach of contract, a disruption to the system he so carefully controlled. But as his finger hovered over the screen, he stopped. The feeling from the airplane, the low, insistent hum under his skin, was back, stronger than ever. It wasn't annoyance. It was a deeper, colder prickle of fear. Something was wrong. Not just with his maid, but with his house. With his world, he turned away from the kitchen and started toward the grand staircase, his feet feeling heavy and clumsy. He wasn't an investigator. He was a man of balance sheets and projections. He solved problems with logic and money. He should be making a call. But his body was moving on its own, drawn toward an unknown destination. He climbed the stairs, his hand gripping the cool glass of the railing. The second floor was a long, bright hallway bathed in the fading light of the day. Doors lined the walls, leading to rooms he never entered. They were like secrets, each one a part of his life he had sealed off. And then he heard it. It was so faint, he almost thought he'd imagined it. A sound that didn't belong. It was a low, gentle humming. It wasn't a song he recognized, no melody he could place. It was a simple, repetitive tune, a thread of sound weaving its way through the stone-cold silence of the house. It was the kind of sound a mother would make to soothe a crying child. The sound was utterly out of place, a piece of a different, softer world that had somehow gotten lost in his. He stopped, his heart starting to beat a little faster, a hard, uneven rhythm against his ribs. The humming stopped, and for a second, the silence rushed back in to fill the void. Then a new sound took its place, a voice. It was a woman's voice, soft and low, speaking words he couldn't quite make out. Dot, dot, dot. There now. That's much better. Just a little more. You're so brave. The voice was not eyeless. He was sure of it. This voice was older, more fragile, but filled with a warmth and tenderness that seemed to physically warm the air. It was a voice that was used to giving comfort. He found himself moving toward it, his steps silent on the plush runner that ran down the center of the hall. The sound was coming from the far end of the house, the east wing. A part of the property he kept shut off, a cluster of guest suites that hadn't been occupied in years. The door to the last room, the presidential suite, was slightly ajar. A thin, warm sliver of light cut across the dark wood of the floor. He reached the door and stood there for a moment, his hand hovering in the air. Every instinct, every part of his logical brain was screaming at him to turn back. This was a security breach, an unknown person in his house. This was a problem to be managed, a situation to be controlled, but he couldn't move. He was pinned to the spot by a force stronger than logic, a desperate, burning need to know what was on the other side of that door. He took a slow, deep breath and pushed it open. The scene that met his eyes was so alien, so profoundly impossible, that for a moment his brain refused to process it. The room, which was supposed to be a sterile, unused box, was alive. The air was thick with the scent of lavender and something else, something warm and human. The heavy, expensive curtains had been pulled back, and the last of the sunlight poured in, bathing the room in a soft golden glow. A small, worn armchair, a piece of furniture he'd never seen before, was pulled up next to the large, canopied bed, and in the chair was Isla. She wasn't in her uniform. She was wearing faded jeans and a simple gray t-shirt. Her reddish-gold hair was tied back loosely, and a few stray strands curled around her face. She was leaning forward, her expression one of intense focus, her hand gently stroking the hair of the person lying in the bed. She looked up as the door opened, and her eyes wide and filled with a wild mix of shock and fear, locked onto his dot, but it was the person in the bed that shattered his world. It was an old woman, her face a delicate map of fine lines, her skin as thin as parchment. Her hair was a soft silver cloud on the pillow. She was frail, almost transparent, a whisper of a person. And as Julian stood frozen in the doorway, her eyes, the same cloudy, pale blue as his own, slowly blinked open and found him. It was his mother, Eleanor, the mother he had banished to a pristine clinic in Switzerland 3 years ago. A problem to be managed with money and distance. A woman he hadn't seen, hadn't spoken to in over 1,000 days. The shock that hit him wasn't a jolt. It was a physical blow, a wave of such immense force that it knocked the air from his lungs. The room tilted violently, and he stumbled back, his hand flying out to slam against the wall, his fingers scrabbling for purchase on the smooth, cold paint. His mouth opened, but a choked, strangled gasp was all that came out. He looked from the fragile, impossible face of his mother in the bed to the fierce, defiant face of the girl he had paid to dust his shelves. This wasn't his maid. This was a guardian. And in that moment, Julian Vance, a man who controlled millions, realized he had absolutely no control at all. The world came back into focus in a series of sharp, painful jabs. The first was the cold, hard wall against his back. The second was the faint, clean scent of lavender that now felt like an accusation. The third was the sound of his own ragged breathing, a desperate gulping sound that was ugly and alien in his own ears. He was a man who prided himself on control, on the steady, even rhythm of his heart and his mind. But now, his heart was a wild drum against his ribs, and his mind was a roaring, chaotic storm. He stared, unable to look away, his eyes locked on the woman in the bed. His mother. A ghost from a life he had sealed off and buried under layers of money and distance. Her name was a ghost on his lips, a word he hadn't spoken out loud in years. Eleanor. It wasn't a question. It was a disbelieving prayer. The frail woman on the pillow blinked slowly, her cloudy eyes trying to bring his face into focus. Her lips moved, but no sound came out, just a dry, rustling whisper. She looked from him to Isla, a flicker of confusion in her gaze, as if she wasn't sure which of them was real. It was that look, that flicker of vulnerability, that broke the spell of Julian's paralysis. He pushed himself off the wall, standing up straight, forcing the steel back into his spine. The shock was beginning to crystallize into something he could understand, something he could handle. Anger. It was a clean, sharp emotion. It was a tool he knew how to use, his eyes cold and hard as chips of ice. Shifted from his mother to the girl standing protectively by the bed. Isla. He had barely registered her before. But now she was the center of his universe. She wasn't cowering. She wasn't apologizing. She had straightened up to her full height. She was standing with her shoulders back, a silent, immovable barrier between him and the woman in the bed. Her fear was still there, a tightness around her eyes. But it was buried under something much stronger: defiance. It was the kind of quiet, unyielding strength he usually only saw in boardrooms, and it infuriated him. This was his house, his employee, a life. How dare she? Isla, he said. His voice was flat, devoid of any warmth, a dangerous quiet that was more menacing than a shout. Explain now. The words were not a request. They were an order, a command he had used 1,000 times to get what he wanted. Illa took a small, almost imperceptible step closer to the bed. Her hands, which had been hanging loosely at her sides, were now clenched into small, tight fists. Mr. Vance, she said, and her voice, though steady, was softer than he expected. It was the same voice she used to hum with, and the sound of it now made his skin crawl. I understand you're shocked, but please, you need to be quiet. You'll upset her. Upset her. The words were so absurd they almost made him laugh. He had spent a fortune to have her not upset in a state-of-the-art facility 3,000 miles away. And here she was, lying in a guest bed in his own house, being cared for by a girl he knew nothing about. The sheer, audacious insanity of the situation was staggering. You will explain what is happening, he repeated, his voice dropping lower, the threat now unmistakable. You will explain why my mother, who is supposed to be in a clinic in Geneva, is in a bed in my house. And you will explain your part in this. Now. He took a step into the room, a predator advancing on his territory. The air grew thick with unspoken words, with the weight of 1,000,000 unasked questions. He saw Illa's jaw tighten. She wasn't going to back down. She looked at the woman in the bed, her expression softening for a fraction of a second. A silent communication passing between them. Then she looked back at Julian, her hazel eyes clear and direct. Her name is Margaret, Isla began, and the name, so ordinary, so human, stopped Julian in his tracks. Margaret Bell. She was your family's house manager for over 40 years. She retired 2 years ago. Julian blinked. Margaret. Of course he knew the name. He remembered a kind, round-faced woman who always smelled of cinnamon and had a gentle smile. She had been a fixture in his childhood, a constant, quiet presence in the background of his life. He had signed her retirement papers without a second thought, authorizing a generous pension and moving on. She was another closed file. What does she have to do with this? He asked, his voice still laced with ice. She couldn't bear it, Isla said, her voice gaining a little strength, a little conviction. She couldn't bear to see Eleanor in that place. She said it was a beautiful prison. All chrome and white walls and nurses with timers. She said Eleanor was wasting away, not from her illness, but from loneliness. Julian felt a hot, defensive surge rise in his chest. It was the best facility in the world. he shot back. The best doctors, the best care. Money was no object. Money wasn't what she needed, Isla countered softly, and the quiet truth in her words hit him like a physical blow. Margaret said she needed a home. She needed to see the sky she remembered, to feel the sun she grew up with. She needed to be somewhere she felt loved. The story began to unfold, piece by improbable piece, in the quiet, sunlit room. Margaret, using her intimate knowledge of the property and the discretionary family funds Julian had long forgotten existed, had orchestrated everything. She had contacted the clinic, using the leverage of Eleanor's long-term care contract and a hefty donation to arrange for a compassionate transfer. Not from a maid service, but through a university program for nursing students. The job as a maid for the entire property was a cover story, a brilliant and necessary lie, a way to justify her constant presence without raising any red flags. I was supposed to just be her caregiver, Isla explained, her gaze never leaving his face. Margaret's health is failing. She can't be here all the time. I was to be Eleanor's nurse, her companion. The maid thing. That was Margaret's idea. She said you wouldn't notice. Not really. She said you were always so busy. There was no accusation in her tone, only a simple statement of fact, but it landed like a punch to the gut. He hadn't noticed. He hadn't noticed a thing. As she spoke, the frail woman in the bed began to stir more. A faint, raspy sound came from her throat, and she reached a thin, trembling hand out from under the covers, her fingers searching. Isla immediately turned her attention away from Julian, all of her focus on the older woman. "I'm here, Eleanor." "I'm right here," she whispered, taking the searching hand in her own and holding it gently. She brought it to her cheek, closing her eyes for a moment. It was in a gesture of such pure, uncomplicated affection that it made Julian's heart feel like it was being squeezed in a fist. He watched as Isla adjusted the blanket, as she fluffed the pillows behind Eleanor's head, as she spoke to her in a low, soothing voice. He saw the way his mother's eyes, though cloudy, followed Isla's every movement, a look of absolute trust and adoration in their depths. He saw a small, fragile table beside the bed, covered not with medical equipment, but with a small, wilting bouquet of wildflowers, a worn hardback book with a faded cover, and a framed photograph. He leaned in closer, his breath catching in his throat. It was a picture of him as a small boy, no older than 6 or 7, laughing on the beach with his mother. Her arms wrapped around him, her face alight with a joy he had completely forgotten. That photograph was a shard of glass from another life, a life that had been full of color and warmth and sound, a life before he had learned to translate everything into numbers, before he had built his fortress of glass and steel to keep the world out. He looked from the laughing boy in the picture to the hard, cold man he was now, standing in the middle of a love story he hadn't even known was being written in his own house. The anger that had been his shield, his armor, began to crumble, flaking away to reveal the raw, terrified shame that was rotting away at his core. He hadn't just been busy. He had been willfully blind. He had curated his own emptiness with the same meticulous care he applied to his stock portfolio. He thought of all the times he had been in this house, just a few floors below, while his own mother was being loved and cared for by a stranger. He thought of all the calls he had ignored, the letters he hadn't read, the quiet, steady presence of a woman who had given him everything, whom he had discarded like an outdated asset. The silence in the room was no longer a weapon he could use against her. It was a mirror, reflecting the hollowness of his own soul. He had come home expecting to find the order of his world intact, but he had stumbled into the one thing his money could never buy, a truth so beautiful and so brutal. It was going to break him apart, and he was beginning to realize, with a dawning and horrifying certainty, that he deserved it. The silence that followed Isla's story was not an empty one. It was heavy, saturated with things unsaid, ghosts and regrets, and the faint rhythmic sound of his mother's breathing. Julian stood by the door, no longer seeing the room as a crime scene or a violation, as a sacred space he had desecrated with his anger. The story was still settling over him, layer by layer, each fact a new weight pressing down on his chest. Margaret, the housekeeper. The quiet, unassuming woman who had known him since he was a boy. She had seen his coldness, his emotional neglect, and instead of judging him, she had simply taken matters into her own kind, capable hands. She had outmaneuvered him with a weapon he had no defense against: love and Isla. He looked at her again, really looked at her for the first time. She wasn't just a pretty girl with a nice smile and a quiet way of moving. She was a strategist, a co-conspirator, a nurse, a companion. She was a young woman who had dedicated her life, not for a paycheck, but for a person. She had navigated his complex world, lived a lie day in and day out, all for the sake of the fragile woman holding her hand. The sheer moral courage of it was staggering. He, who thought he was a master of the universe because he could manipulate market trends, was standing in the presence of a true giant. She had built a world of warmth and safety right under his nose, and he hadn't even noticed. The shame that had been simmering in his gut now began to boil, a sickening, corrosive heat that rose up into his throat. He felt the urge to run, to flee from this room, from these eyes that saw him so clearly. But his feet were leaden, rooted to the spot. He had nowhere to go. This was his house, but he was the one who didn't belong. Illa's voice was gentle, cutting through the fog in his mind. He realized he had just been standing there, staring, his face a mask of shock and horror. "Are you all right?" The question, so simple and so kind, was almost more than he could bear. He wasn't all right. He was the furthest thing from all right. He had spent his life building a wall, and in the span of 5 minutes that wall had been turned to dust. He shook his head, a small, barely perceptible motion. He looked at his mother, whose eyes had drifted closed again, her face peaceful in the fading light. He saw the small lines around her mouth, the gentle curve of her nose. He saw the woman who had read him stories, who had bandaged his scraped knees, who had believed in him with a fierce, unwavering faith that he had never, ever earned. "I need to sit down," he managed to say, his voice a rough, unfamiliar croak. Isla didn't hesitate. She gently eased Eleanor's hand back onto the blanket and moved to a small armchair in the corner, a different one from the one she had been using. She pulled it out for him. It was a simple, worn-looking chair. It's the kind of comfortable piece of furniture you'd find in a grandmother's living room. It felt completely out of place in his house, and yet it was the most authentic thing in the entire building. He sank into it, the worn fabric a strange comfort against his stiff, tailored suit. For a long time, nobody spoke. Julian just sat there, his head in his hands, trying to piece his world back together, only to find that the pieces didn't fit anymore. The life he had so carefully constructed was revealed as a cheap, flimsy facade. He thought about all the late nights he'd spent staring at spreadsheets, all the deals he'd chased, all the praise he'd received for his brilliance. No, all of it felt like a cruel joke. He was a king of an empty kingdom, a master of a hollow enterprise. "How is she?" he finally asked, the words muffled by his hands. He didn't look up. He couldn't. "The doctor said she has good days and bad days," Isla said softly. She had moved to stand by the window, giving him a small measure of space, though he felt her presence like a steady, calming warmth. The move was hard on her, but being here, it's given her a reason to fight. "She talks about you, you know?" Julian's head snapped up at that. "She does." He couldn't imagine what his mother would have to say about him. She talks about me?" "She does," Isla confirmed, a small, sad smile touching her lips. "She doesn't talk about the company or the deals. She talks about the little boy in the photograph. She tells me stories about how you used to build elaborate forts out of pillows in the living room. Ow! And how you were convinced you could teach the dog to talk. She remembers you, Julian. Not the man you've become, but the boy you were." He felt a sharp pain behind his eyes, a hot, stinging pressure. He was not a man who cried. He hadn't cried since his father's funeral, an event he had processed as a hostile takeover of his life. But now, the thought of his mother remembering him as that innocent, hopeful boy, of her holding onto that one small, perfect memory while he had erased her from his daily existence, was a physical pain. He looked over at the photograph on the table, at the laughing boy with his whole life ahead of him. a boy who would have been horrified to know what he would become. "I thought she was getting the best," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't name. "I thought money could fix it. Money solves everything. It's going to buy the best bed, the best medicine, the best doctors," Isla agreed, her voice gentle but firm. "But it can't buy a memory. It can't buy a hand to hold in the middle of the night. It can't buy the sound of a familiar voice singing you an old song. Some things, Mr. Vance, aren't for sale." He knew she was right. He had always known it on some level, but he had been too arrogant, too frightened to admit it. It was easier to hide behind his balance sheets, to believe that every problem had a logical, transactional solution. It was easier than facing the messy, unpredictable, terrifying world of human connection. "I have to fix this," he said, more to himself than to her. But the words sounded hollow, even to his own ears. How could he fix this? How could he possibly undo years of neglect with a single grand gesture? He couldn't buy his mother more time. He couldn't buy back the years he had lost. He couldn't erase the cold, selfish man he had been. "You can start by being here," Isla said simply, as if reading his mind. "She knows you're here now. She needs to know that it's okay." He looked from Isla to his mother, who was sleeping peacefully, a faint smile on her lips, as if she were lost in a pleasant dream. He knew what Isla meant. His mother needed to know that he wasn't angry, that he understood, that he accepted this beautiful, secret world that had been created for her. Slowly, awkwardly, Julian pushed himself out of the comfortable chair. His legs felt stiff and uncoordinated, as if he were learning to walk again. He crossed the small space to the bed, each step feeling monumental. The floor didn't feel like polished concrete anymore. It felt like sacred ground. He stood over his mother, his massive shadow falling over her small form. He saw the rise and fall of her chest, the delicate blue veins on her eyelids, the soft, downy hair on her cheeks. She was so fragile. A breath of wind could break her, and he, her son, had been the one to put her in a glass box. Far away from the sun, he reached out a hand, his own hand large and clumsy by comparison. He hesitated for a moment, his fingers hovering just above her cheek. He was afraid to touch her, afraid that his touch would be cold, that it would carry the memory of all the years he had been away. He felt Isla's eyes on him, but she didn't say a word. She just waited. Finally, he let his hand drop, his fingers gently brushing against her cheek. Her skin was soft, impossibly soft, like the petal of an old flower. It was warm with life. At his touch, his mother's eyelids fluttered, and she let out a soft sigh. She didn't wake up, but she didn't pull away. She leaned into his touch, a subtle, almost involuntary gesture of trust. It was the smallest thing in the world, but to Julian, it felt like a pardon. It felt like a beginning. He kept his hand there for a long time, just feeling the warmth of her skin, the gentle rhythm of her breathing. He wasn't thinking about deals or markets or his own ego. He wasn't thinking about the logistics or the complications. He was just a son, sitting with his mother. And in that quiet, golden light in the small, secret room at the heart of his empty house, Julian Vance, the millionaire, began to understand the first and most important transaction of his life, the one he had to make with his own heart. He had paid for everything else. But this, he knew, was going to cost him everything he had left to give. And for the first time, he was willing to pay the price. The sun had set, and the room was now bathed in the soft, warm glow of a single lamp on the nightstand. It cast long, gentle shadows, making the space feel even more like a sanctuary, a world set apart from the cold, sterile house outside the door. Julian was still sitting, but he had moved from the worn armchair to a simple wooden stool he'd found in the corner. He was closer to the bed now, his posture no longer rigid and defensive, but hunched forward, his elbows on his knees, his hands clasped together. He had been there for hours, just watching. He watched the slow, steady rise and fall of his mother's chest. He watched the way the lamplight caught the silver strands in her hair. He was trying to memorize her face, to burn it into his memory. To make up for all the time he had spent looking away, Isla had moved quietly around the room, tidying things, preparing a small cup of what she told him was herbal tea for when his mother woke. She didn't speak to him, giving him the space he needed to process the monumental shift in his world. Her quiet presence was a comfort, a silent anchor in the storm of his own thoughts. He felt a deep, profound gratitude toward her, a feeling so unfamiliar it was almost painful. She had not only cared for his mother, she had preserved a part of his own soul he hadn't known was missing. Eventually, he stood up. The decision wasn't a thought. It was an impulse, a deep, undeniable need to act. "I'll be back," he said, his voice quiet but clear. It was the first thing he had said in a long time. Isla looked at him, her gaze searching, and gave a small, understanding nod. He left the room, closing the door softly behind him, as if he were leaving a sleeping child. The moment he stepped back into the dark, empty hallway, the chill of his house rushed back in to meet him. The place that had always felt like a fortress of control now felt like a tomb. The high ceilings and vast empty spaces weren't symbols of success anymore. They were monuments to his own loneliness. He walked through the house, not as its owner, but as a visitor. He saw the cold perfection of the living room, the untouched grand piano, the soulless art on the walls. It was all a lie. He had been decorating the cage, not the home. He went down to his office, a space that had always been his sanctuary. He sat behind his massive desk, the dark wood gleaming under the track lighting. He saw the screens on the wall showing the global markets, the endless streams of data that had once been his entire world. They looked meaningless now. It's like a foreign language he had once been fluent in but had now completely forgotten. He picked up his phone. His thumb hovered over his assistant's name, ready to dictate a flurry of orders, to start managing, to start controlling the situation. But he stopped. He couldn't manage this. He couldn't control this. This was a human problem, and human problems couldn't be solved with a spreadsheet or a directive. They required something else, something he had to learn. He put the phone down, a simple action that felt like a surrender. Instead, he found Margaret's number in an old, archived contact list on his computer. He hesitated for only a moment before dialing. The woman who answered was frail, her voice thin and reedy, but it was still the same warm voice he remembered from his childhood. "Mr. Vance," she said, a note of surprise and fear in her tone. "Is everything all right?" "Margaret," he said, and his own voice was thick with emotion. "Everything is not all right. But it's going to be. Thank you." That was all he could say. It was inadequate. It was nothing, but it was all he had. He heard a soft, relieved sigh on the other end of the line. And he knew she understood. He spent the rest of the night making a different kind of call. He didn't call his lawyers or his accountants. He called the chef who came once a week to stock the freezer with gourmet meals he never ate. He gave him new instructions. He wanted simple food, soups, stews, things that were warm and easy to digest. He called a landscaping company and told them to tear out the stark, sculpted gardens in the front, and plant a wildflower meadow, the kind his mother used to love. He was changing his house, not with money, but with intention. He was trying to fill the empty spaces with pieces of his mother, with pieces of himself. The next morning he woke up not in his own bed, but in the armchair in his mother's room, his back stiff and his neck sore. He hadn't meant to fall asleep. Ela was already awake, quietly preparing a small breakfast of oatmeal and tea. She looked at him, a question in her eyes, but he just shook his head. He wasn't ready to leave. He watched as she gently woke his mother, helping her to sit up, fluffing her pillows, talking to her in that soft, steady voice. When Eleanor saw him sitting there, her cloudy eyes widened in recognition. A slow, beautiful smile spread across her face. "Julian," she whispered, her voice a dry, fragile thing. It was the first time she had said his name in years. He felt his throat close up. He went to her and took her hand. It was so small in his. "I'm here, Mom," he said, the words feeling foreign and precious on his tongue. "I'm here." He spent the day with her. He didn't know what to do at first. He had forgotten how to just be. But Isla guided him, without him even realizing it. She suggested he read to her from the worn book on the table. It was a collection of old fairy tales, the same ones she used to read to him. As he stumbled over the familiar words, his mother would close her eyes, a contented look on her face, and sometimes she would murmur the ending to a story before he got to it. He sat with her while she ate, not trying to talk, just being present. He told her about the flight from Tokyo, about the strange feeling that had brought him home. He didn't analyze it or try to explain it. He just told her the story. And she listened, her hands still in his, her expression one of deep, peaceful understanding. A few days later, Julian made another decision. He called Isla into his office. She stood before his desk, not looking at him, but at the floor, as if she were expecting to be fired. He could feel her anxiety, and it made his heart ache. "Isla," he began, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. "I'm terminating your employment." Her head snapped up, her eyes wide with shock and a flash of hurt. He saw her brace herself, her chin lifting in that familiar, defiant way. He quickly held up a hand.
"Please let me finish,"
he said. "I am terminating your employment as a maid. That job was an insult to you, and I am ashamed that I ever put you in that position." Stood up and walked around the desk, closing the distance between them. He looked her directly in the eye, his gaze open and honest for what felt like the first time in his life. "I would like to offer you a new job," he said. "The official, formal, and very well-compensated position of my mother's primary caregiver. You will have a full medical and dental plan, a salary that will allow you to pay for the rest of your education and then some, and a private suite in this house for as long as you wish to stay. Furthermore, Vanguard Digital will pay for the remainder of your nursing degree, in full, no strings attached. Your only job is to continue to be exactly who you are." He saw the disbelief in her eyes, followed by a slow dawning of hope. He saw her shoulders, which had been held so taut, finally begin to relax. "I don't know what to say," she stammered. "Just say yes," he said, and for the first time in a very long time, a genuine smile touched his lips. "Say yes, and let's move my mother into the master suite. She belongs in the sun." That was the beginning. The change wasn't instantaneous, but it was real. The cold, empty mansion began to fill with life. His mother was moved to the master bedroom, which Julian redecorated with her favorite things, soft quilts, her old records, photographs from a lifetime of memories. He learned to cook a few of her favorite simple meals. He learned to sit with her in silence, not feeling the need to fill the space with useless talk. He spent hours just listening to her stories, piecing together the history of his own family that he had so carelessly discarded. He and Isla developed a new kind of relationship, one built on mutual respect and a shared mission. She was no longer his employee in any real sense. She was his partner in this new, fragile life they were building. She taught him about medicine, about patience, about the small, quiet acts of love that truly mattered. He, in turn, made sure she had everything she needed to pursue her own dreams, not as a transaction, but as a gift. One evening months later, Julian was sitting in the living room. The cold, minimalist furniture was gone, replaced by soft, comfortable couches and warm, colorful rugs. A fire was crackling in the fireplace. His mother was asleep in her room, and Isla was in the kitchen, humming as she made tea. He looked around the room at the photographs on the mantelpiece, the meadow of wildflowers blooming outside the window, and he felt a quiet peace settle over him. He hadn't been on a plane in 3 months. He hadn't looked at a stock report in weeks. The deals, the money, the frantic chase for Merit, all seemed like a life lived by someone else. He had returned home unexpectedly, searching for something he couldn't name. What he found was the beautiful, messy, unpredictable reality of love. And it was the first truly priceless thing he had ever owned.